Hey everybody, this is Allison with Seasoned Equestrians. Minnie and I are here today to share a little bit about our farm prep for winter weather events. I've got 5 tips. Stay tuned to the end because number 5 might very well be the most important one. I'm glad you're here. I started this video about 3 weeks ago because we were getting ready to have our first major winter weather event here in North Carolina, and I thought it would be nice to share with you how I go about preparing the barn and the horses for winter weather. Well, it turns out that winter event happened one weekend, and before we were even through that event, we were anticipating a second weekend, and even now as I wrap this up, we're looking at yet another winter weather event coming in this weekend, and they're even threatening one next week. So it's really unusual for us to have 4 significant weather events, winter weather events, all back to back in North Carolina. So it's even more important that I share this with you. Now I'm going to tell you, some of you in those northern states, you might find it really funny that, you know, we make that mad rush to the grocery store here in North Carolina and hold up for days and days. But it's a real challenge for those of us who just aren't used to these kinds of events. I will say, however, just about every place in the country deals with some sort of significant weather event that you can actually plan for and project. Some of what we're going to talk about today is going to apply for that as well. So the first thing is it's really important, especially during those times of year when you can expect significant weather events, to keep an eye on the weather. Not a bad idea to watch what's going on the television, but it's also not a bad idea to have a couple of apps that keep you posted because, you know, it's the best job in the world being a meteorologist. You can be wrong more than 50% of the time and keep your job, but it gives you an idea of what the different sources are projecting in terms of the upcoming weather event. Have something on social media that's locally focused. Here where we're located, we're fortunate to be close to Fort Bragg and Simmons Airfield. I'll put the link in the description. They're great, even if you're not from around here. But they do a really good job of giving us some very relevant weather information. But again, it's good to be monitoring that weather from a couple of different locations and different sources, because a lot of what you're going to do to prepare for a significant weather event is going to happen several days before it actually hits your area. First and foremost, hay. Hay is a very significant part of your horse's diet. In fact, if you're going to run out of anything, you want to run out of horse feed before you run out of hay, because it is something that's crucial to keeping a horse's digestive system healthy and their body functioning as it should. For a winter weather event, it's especially important that you make appropriate plans for your hay supply, because oftentimes, if you're like me, you haven't turned the horses back out on that winter pasture that you seeded back in the fall. But it's also, if it's a snow event or an ice event, the horses may not get to the grass that's on the ground, even if it's ready for them to be grazing on and getting that source of nourishment. So you need to anticipate what your need is and then purchase it early. And the reason you want to purchase it early is, first and foremost, you don't want to be caught without once that weather event happens. You may not realize it, but you might find yourself, if you don't make the appropriate plans, running out right in the middle of a significant weather event. You also don't want to be caught trying to purchase it during the actual weather event itself, because you don't want to transport the hay and it get wet and damaged that way, but then there's no guarantee that your supplier is even going to be open during the weather event. You also don't want to wait till the last minute to get your supply of hay, because other people are going to be trying to do the same thing, and the hay may run out super quickly, which would be a really tragic thing if the hay that you are accustomed to feeding your horses runs out because everybody else made a run on the hay at the same time. You also want to expect to use more hay than you normally would. My philosophy is I would rather my horses have too much hay than not enough, because hay is what helps them stay warm during these cold weather events. It's especially important to consider purchasing more than you need, because you don't know how long the area is going to be shut down because of the adverse weather event. And especially if you're experiencing unusual weather like those of us in North Carolina have been experiencing, we may not be able to get hay back in the area for a while after a big snowstorm comes through because of the supply chain issues that we're not only experiencing in general, but across the country in every product and every industry. During these adverse weather events, you're actually going to be using more hay than you normally do. You want to make sure they have free access to it as much as possible so that, again, they are keeping their systems working and moving the way that they should do, but then they also have that extra help to stay warm during the adverse weather event. Barn preparations, number 2. The first thing that you want to make sure of is that the areas that the horses are going to be spending the most time in are clean and bedded with clean bedding. And this could be your run-in shelters if you've got a setup where your horses are out 24/7. It could be stalls where your horses will either have free access to in and out of the weather event, or it could be that you lock them up at night. You want to be sure that before the event comes in, that they are ready for the horses. You're ready to tuck them in, because you don't want to be out in the middle of a weather event trying to clean stalls and spread manure or pull wheelbarrows over and dump them in manure piles. You also want to make sure that they've got a warm, safe place to go to get out of the weather. If you're like me, you want to throw those horses out of the stall so you can clean without having to work around them. And doing so puts them out in the weather, which means they have an increased likelihood of being cold throughout the duration of the winter weather event. It's important to also get extra bedding so that as the weather event progresses and on the other side of it, when things are melting, that you have extra bedding to replace what either gets soiled from the horses being locked up and in the stalls or in the run-ins, or those that get damaged or wet because of horses coming in and out with snow in their feet, bringing in ice and snow that ends up melting and dampening the entire bedding setup. Throughout the course of the weather event, and then on the other side of it, you just want to make sure that your horse has a dry place to get out of the weather. You need to make a plan for what you're going to do in case the water at your barn is unavailable. Backing it up a little bit, you want to do everything you possibly can to make sure that it doesn't freeze up. What we do at our barn is on the inside of our tack room is the actual tube or pipe that goes into the faucet, and we've got that wrapped in a material that plugs in, so when the cold weather comes we plug that in so that doesn't freeze. And then I have a heat lamp that I put on the faucet itself. I remove the water hose, but then I put that heat lamp so that it keeps the faucet warm overnight as well. You should evaluate your heated buckets to make sure that they're working, and if they're not, consider purchasing heated buckets that go in the stall if you want to try to keep warmer water in the stall. You should also do the same thing with any heating element you have in any pasture troughs, just to make sure that it's working. The worst time to find out it's not working is in the middle of a winter weather event. Some of the preferred items in that regard are linked in the description for your consideration if you'd like to take a look. Linking in with the hay discussion, you might want to consider getting one of those slow feeder hay nets to hang in the stalls, especially at night. That way there's a way for you to keep hay in front of your horses when you're not necessarily going out to the barn every couple hours to check on them, which will in turn help them stay warmer throughout the course of the night. If you do have them, go ahead and evaluate them and make sure that they're in good repair so that they're ready to be hung when you need them during the course of the weather event. Number 3, prepping your horses. First and foremost, you want to consider whether or not you are going to blanket your horse. I don't want to get into any debate about whether or not you should or should not blanket horses. There are folks out there that have horses that live in weather that's far worse than anything we'll ever see in North Carolina, that have never had a blanket on their body and they are just fine. And in most instances, horses will be fine. But you know your horse better. You may have a horse that's been body clipped. You may have a horse that's overly sensitive. You may have a senior horse like my Billy. He's older. I'm not exactly sure how old he is, but I've really noticed this year that he's more sensitive to the cold. So I've just made a decision this year when it's in the 30s, he gets a blanket. unless of course it's during that time, that one night where he wouldn't let me put the blanket on. I didn't argue with him, and I let him go through the night without the blanket, and he was fine. On another occasion, I decided not to put a blanket on him, and the next morning I went out and he was clearly cold and was clearly aggravated that I had let him get cold. Today when I went to turn him out on the pasture, he wouldn't let me take his blanket off. He was more interested in getting to that grass than he was worried about his blanket. But you need to be the judge of that. You need to decide whether or not that's something that you need to do. And if you have the blankets, evaluate them to make sure they're in good repair. Again, this is something you want to do before the big weather event becomes an issue, because the last thing you're going to be able to do is run around at the last minute and find somebody to do blanket repairs. If you don't have them and you think you should, then now's the time to purchase them. Again, well in advance so that you're prepared. It is an ongoing evaluation process that really does begin sometimes before the weather event is even projected. During this time of prep, when you're really pushing up to the start of the weather event, you really don't want to do anything that significantly changes your feeding regimen. You also don't want to subject your horse to any sort of unnecessary veterinary care, just because they need all of their body systems to help them stay warm during the course of this event. If you're not doing it already, you might want to consider soaking some sort of hay cube. And again, this is going to be based on what your horse's needs are and their diet. I do it all year round because in the wintertime, I know that when I soak their feed and I soak their hay, they're getting liquid in them. And in the summertime, it's the same thing. It's just a way to keep getting that fluid in their body, which is especially important at times when they're less inclined to drink. And if you're not in a position to be able to provide them with warmer water, it really does help ensure they keep those systems lubricated. You'll want to soak those hay cubes in a warm location, whether it's Timothy, alfalfa, orchard, whatever mix of any of the above, simply because you do not want to take that out to your horse and give them something cold when they're already trying to use their body to keep themselves warm. If you can give them something at least at room temperature, then it helps them maintain the warmth that they've been able to sustain throughout the time since they were last fed. And if you can warm it up and make it kind of like a horsey oatmeal, that is another thing that will help maintain their warmth. It will make them more inclined to eat it because they'll be more inclined to eat the warm mix as opposed to something cold. And it helps keep that body lubricated. Call it horsey oatmeal, if you will. And if you don't do so already, you might want to consider adding a tablespoon of mineral salt to your horse's feed, simply because it's kind of like an electrolyte. Actually, I guess it is an electrolyte. It's going to encourage your horse to drink. It's going to make your horse thirsty. So if you're like me and you love to go eat at the Japanese restaurant where they cook at your table and you get sushi and you just really indulge in soy sauce, you know, afterwards your tongue is just dying for something to drink. It's kind of the equivalent of that, although I don't think it has the same effect on horses. It just encourages them to drink. Again, this is something that I do all year long because I want to make sure, whether it's a cold weather event hitting the area or if it's a drastic change in the barometric pressure, which causes havoc on a horse's insides, or if it's in the middle of the summer and I just want them to make sure they're drinking to stay hydrated, it's a good practice to help encourage them to drink. So we've talked a lot about making sure that we're prepped to feed the horses. We've talked a lot about making sure the horses have what they need to have a safe, warm, comfortable place to spend this storm. Let's talk about you. Let's talk about the human preparation. Now, if you're like us, if you're like me, living here in the South, I don't know how to dress for the cold weather. And that's part of the reason why I hate having to get dressed for the cold weather, because I never know what to put on. I never know how much to put on. And I really don't have the right stuff to keep myself warm during these kinds of events. The best gift that my husband gave me one year was a pair of coveralls and a big Carhartt jacket. And I've had them for about 6 years now. No, I've had them for about 8 years now. I love them. And he actually gets kind of tickled when I put them on because that's the telltale sign that it's getting cold out. But the problem is that if you put too much on and you're out working in the barn, more often than not, I get out there, I've got too much on and I start getting sweaty. But I'd rather be too warm as opposed to too cold. So evaluate your gear. Make sure you have what you need to keep yourself warm. Again, prior to the onset of that weather event, do some evaluations about what you actually need in your wardrobe to make sure that you are going to stay warm during this time. I have linked again in the description the coveralls and jacket that I have that I really, really love. Feel free to check it out. Try to get enough rest. During this time, you're probably going to be spending double the amount of time at the barn that you normally do doing that routine care. You're going to be going out, probably picking out stalls more frequently. You're probably going to go out more frequently during the day and check water, replacing water, refilling hay nets or throwing fresh hay, and just overall checking on the horses. You may be going out and switching out blankets a couple of times throughout the course of the weather event. So it's going to be really important for you to give yourself time to rest. This is going to be especially true if this kind of weather event isn't normal for your area. In all likelihood, are going to be physically exhausted and in some cases emotionally exhausted because you're concerned and worried about whether or not you've done enough to make sure that the horses are going to be healthy, safe, and warm throughout the weather event. And if you're caring for somebody else's horse, that's going to even be a bigger burden to make sure that you've done everything you possibly could to carry the barn family through this event. Recognize that the impact of a significant weather event takes its toll. If you find that you're a little bit grumpier than you normally are, or a little bit more emotional than you normally are, package that in such a way that you recognize its connection with what you're going through and what you're dealing with. Realize that it will likely subside once the storm passes, literally. Don't be afraid to ask for help. The horse community is big, but it's also small. And everybody at any given time has something that comes up that they just can't handle by themselves. Go ahead and reach out, ask for help, ask for guidance, ask for suggestions. In all likelihood, it probably won't be long before you're able to return the favor. And number 5. Now for the biggest tip of all. This is the one thing that I learned in this long January that's lasted 6 months, and that is be flexible. Have a plan, set that plan in motion, but be prepared that something may come up that will make you have to do something different. And I'll give you a perfect example. I had decided that I was not going to lock the horses up in their stalls for the first weather event. I was going to give them free access to go back and forth so that after they'd eaten, if they needed to get out and move around and walk around, they would be able to do that so that they had the ability to self-regulate their body warmth. I had a blanket on Billy, and I didn't blanket Ruby because she is my Irish draft and she was born in the rain. Well, not really, but she was bred in the rain. So anyway, the first morning after the big storm and after all the prep, and it turned out to just be an ice storm, and we just had a lot of rainy, wet, frozen stuff that wasn't pretty. I actually slept late that morning because I was so exhausted from the preparation, and at about 8:30 I went outside and Billy had locked himself out of the stall. I don't know how he did it, don't know how he managed it, but my senior horse that I fret about the most and worry about the most had been standing outside in the rain for long enough to have developed these wonderful icicles in his mane. I was heartbroken for him. So I brought him inside and I took off his blanket, which was soaking wet. Fortunately, he was only wet from his neck down to his shoulder, so that wasn't too bad. But he was pretty miserable. So I locked the horses in to feed them breakfast just so that Ruby wouldn't go and run him off from his feed, and so that he would have the opportunity to eat his feed and eat his hay as long as he wanted to warm himself up. But I decided not to close the top part of the door. I never closed the top part of the door. I didn't even think about it. I took his blanket and I hung it up in the wash rack to let it start drying out. And I went inside and I went back out about 2 hours later. He had dried for the most part, but he was standing there shivering. He was pitiful. So I had to reevaluate. What do I need to do to get this horse warm? So I didn't have the best blanket for him, so I went and took another blanket that was too big for him and put it on him and secured it as best I could. And then I closed those top doors in the stalls and threw him more hay. Went out a couple hours later, he had dried, he had warmed, they were both very snug and content, and crisis averted. Another way that I reevaluated my approach was I'm not going to blanket my Irish horse. Well, I did decide that when the temperatures got down to 18 and it was going to feel like 10, that I was not only going to blanket my horse, Billy, I was going to double blanket him, and I double blanketed Ruby. And I also locked them up in their stalls, and I closed that top door so that they really were protected from the brutal wind of the night. Taking that a step further, over the last couple of days, as we're now looking into the third weather event coming this evening, I have decided to start blanketing Ruby because I'm starting to hear a little bit of a cough in her. So it may be because of the hay. There may be some dust in the hay that's bothering her, but it may be that she's got something going on that if I can keep her warmer, it will allow her body's system to take care of that. I got a vet scheduled on Wednesday, so I'm not worried about that. I'll talk with her about that when she comes out. But again, it's just being flexible. It's reevaluating, deciding what's working and deciding what's not. And then more so than anything else, give yourself a break. We are not perfect. We do the best that we can to make sure that our horses are healthy, happy, and safe. But horses, they are strong. They are able to bounce back easily, but then other times they are just frail as frail can be. And no matter what our best efforts are to keep them safe, they get into something. So do your best, give yourself a break, wrap up, stay warm. The days are getting longer, so that's a positive thing. Thanks for being here. If you haven't done so already, if you got value out of this video, please give me a thumbs up and share it with anybody else that you think might be interested in it. And in the comments, would you leave a tip that you use in prepping your horse for significant weather events? We'd really love to hear how other folks approach things. And of course, if you haven't done so already, please subscribe to my channel. I'd love for you to be a part of this community. I am so committed to trying to help day-to-day, everyday amateur horse owners who have horses in their backyard or front yard, as my case may be, enjoy their horses without feeling like they have to be paying the highest paid instructor at the fanciest facility located in closest proximity to the most glamorous trail riding location you can find. We can love and enjoy our horses right here at home. I'm glad you're here.